So when we get into this talk, I just want to start out with types of confinement barns. I just want to touch on the three major types of barns before I get started on any real details. I want to talk about manure handling because manure handling is probably that decision that has to be made before we can start actually designing a barn. The spacing numbers are going to look very different. The layout, the flow of that barn is going to look very different. And so I want to start out with that manure handling and then go into some spacing numbers. I'm going to reiterate some of the feed bunk, water availability, and actually delve into water a little bit more, and then talk about that ventilation concern. And then I want to just touch at the end on some special considerations in terms of the layout of these barns for calving, creep areas, retrofits. I get a lot of questions about retrofitting barns, and I just want to touch on them at the end here. But before we get into any of that, there are three styles of barns really that are out there on the market. The first is a hoop barn, the second is a gabled barn, that's what's in the bottom, and then the third is a monoslope. And I personally don't sell barns. I don't get paid, I don't care what barn you choose. I just want to help you understand the values and the benefits of each type as well as the challenges with each type. For gabled barns, here in Kentucky, this is the easiest barn to find builders for. We can find people to build gabled barns all day long. There's a lot of crews that are able to put them up. That's a real benefit. We have wood structured trusses. We have metal structures. We have a lot of options out there with gabled barns. Aesthetically, they match a lot of other barns on properties. A lot of people like them. And they are pretty versatile from a ventilation perspective. They accept wind from most directions well, as long as we open up our sidewalls. So no complaints here. I'm showing all of these barns. You'll talk about ventilation at the end with a ridge opening. If you're going to put in a gabled barn, the key is getting that moist air out of that top to protect the lifespan of those trusses or rafters that you have in there so that you don't deteriorate a barn. One of the things we have seen in the upper Midwest is that they started building these barns with not enough ridge vent opening, and they had a lot of barns deteriorate in 10 to 15 years. A lot of very quick deterioration in metal, and it's because they had a lot of moisture buildup on those top surfaces and not enough area for that moist air to come out. Big problem. One of the things we have seen is improvements in genetics and feeding styles from the 70s, and a lot of people didn't improve their ventilation when they moved this direction. And while we're further south, that does not mean that we still can't feed cattle effectively here, so we want to be really careful and make sure that we build these barns so that they last. The hoop barns. I'm going to turn my head the other way to cough, Jeff. Watch out. These hoop barns are really an interesting structure. These are one of those structures that people assume are going to be a lot cheaper. Because when we buy and put up a hoop barn for hay storage, it's a cheaper structure. The hoop barns that are actually engineered for livestock are not tremendously cheaper than putting up a gabled barn. But there are some really nice design elements in a hoop barn. One, because of that curved structure, we actually get a lot of height. That's really encouraging for air movement through these barns from a natural ventilation perspective. They also, because they have a light fabric structure, a lot of light comes into these barns. For people that are feeding black cattle, this makes it much easier to identify disease, to identify differentiation in between animals, to have extra light in that barn, without paying for the electricity to light the barn up like the middle of the day. So there's a lot of benefits to these barns. They've been really well engineered. They're all designed for winds at 110, 115 mile an hour. They have prorated warranties, good warranties on their fabric shells. And those truss structures are pretty substantial. So they are an engineered structure. They come almost as a package deal with a design element. The one caveat I will say is that they're designed for the upper Midwest, so people will sell them to you with a certain number of head in there. And realistically, because of our bedding requirements and our moisture levels, we end up with less animals than what they were really designed for. And sometimes that makes the cost a little bit tricky because they'll sell you at this cost per head space, and we end up paying a little bit more. And sometimes we don't anticipate that. So that's the sort of the sales pitch coming south, giving us a little bit of an incorrect perspective on it. But they're a beautiful barn. I know people that have a standard hay storage hoop barn and they can make it work. The reality is that a hay storage hoop barn is designed to allow air to go through it. It doesn't have high sidewalls. It doesn't allow air to go crossways across it. It's not really designed for cattle. It's not really designed for the load that we're talking about here. People that are successful keeping a couple cows in here, either for a couple days when it's really wet, or just calving in it or doing something like that, most likely are either giving extra space or they're spending a lot of extra money on bedding to keep that barn dry. They have to be doing something because they're not going to get the airflow they need to really dry out these barns the way that these barns with the hoop, with the sidewall that's opened up, and then a ridge vent are going to get ventilation. And the last type of barn up here is the monoslope. This is the barn that gets touted a lot from the upper Midwest for the most ventilation. And the reality is, when this barn is designed and situated correctly, and it receives wind on that south side and that big opening, it moves a lot of air. They are absolutely correct. The engineering numbers do not lie. Physics is good and solid still today. We can move a lot of air through a monoslope barn. The challenge with a monoslope barn here is that we don't get the air directions necessarily that they do in the upper Midwest, and we get a lot of winds that move. Anyone live on a farm where it goes from the west today and then the south tomorrow and then it'll be in the east and you're like, where the hell is this east wind coming from? I have that about once a week on my farm. So the challenge with this barn design is that it has to assume very regular wind directions to get that really good ventilation. And there are some challenges with using it in this area just because our winds are much more variable by direction. The other thing about this barn that's really nice, and we'll talk about it with the ventilation, that airflow, is that it gets a lot of sun in from the south. And in that upper Midwest, that southerly sun coming in the wintertime brings a lot of warmth into that barn at a time of year when there's a lot of stress on those animals with that cold. When it gets into the summer months, that angle changes a little bit, and the depth at which that sun goes into the barn decreases in the summer, which is good. But we do live in a very warm area here, and we still get sun in the barn in the summer. So that is the other thing to recognize, is that we do still have a heat load on that south side of the barn here in Kentucky, and typically that south side is where our feed bunk is. So if we are trying to feed out feeders, and we're getting heavier feeders in the summertime, this is a big stressor on them because they are sitting in that sun path trying to get food to grow. And getting them to stand there long enough and eat enough to grow the way we want them to can be a challenge. A lot of people that feed feeders in a monoslope will feed on both ends of the barn, similar to what Katie was mentioning, because they know that they'll move to that north side in those summer months to eat. They won't want to eat on that south side, which is a little bit of a challenge with this design. So something to consider. It can be made to work, but it is not necessarily the way it is touted from the upper Midwest is not the way it performs necessarily here. But it is still an acceptable design. I see a lot of people very successful with it in this state, and there are definitely ways to make it work, but it is a consideration. Manure handling. This one, I mean, I think all three of us are going to hammer on this manure thing today, and I don't want anyone to leave here really afraid of manure, because it's a really valuable product that we have with cattle. We just need to account for it correctly in our design purposes. There are three styles of manure management: a bedded pack, a compost bedded pack, and a slatted floor. Some people call a slotted floor a liquid manure storage system. And at the end of the day, the important things to ask yourself are, one, how valuable is this manure to me, and how far am I going to move it? Because if I want really good concentrated nutrients, maybe I want to invest the effort and the infrastructure to have a slatted system for feeders. Because if I have to haul it a couple miles, I might not want to haul all that bedding and carbon that many miles. But if I have a cow-calf operation and comfort is part of my priorities, then I better look at a bedded pack system or a compost bedded pack system. I better make sure I have a land base. I better make sure I have equipment for spreading that manure. And I better make sure that that bedding material is available and cost effective. When we get to the economics here later today, we will see how big of a cost bedding can be in these systems. When the producers come up here, ask them about bedding. Ask them how bedding is impacting their decision making, because this is a major operating cost on these designs. People will always say, oh, feed is a major challenge, but if bedding is not properly accounted for, it can be an even bigger challenge, because it can go completely out of whack with where you think your prices are and throw off the whole design. And last but not least, labor. Not only do we have to have a bedding source at the right price, but we also need to have the labor to manage it. If I don't have a labor source, it is the reason that a lot of the barns in the upper Midwest have moved to slatted floor designs, because it is so much easier on a day-to-day basis to manage a slatted floor barn for feeders than it is to manage a bedded pack. But you have to plan to clean out the barn at some point, and you have to plan to clean out that feed or drover's alley on a regular basis. Some people do it every day. Some people have it in a couple times a week. Some people let it build up more than that, but I wouldn't, because I like clean animals, and that's my personal preference. But you have to have a plan to clean out those areas. Before I go into the barn, I just want to touch on this dry lot versus barn, because Katie mentioned this too. And as we come down here and I do some spacing numbers and things, I just want you to look at a little bit of information about what a dry lot looks like versus a barn. And one of the reasons I point this out is because I think by definition, the way NRCS has traditionally defined confinement was 45 days or more feeding an animal on an area that's non-vegetative. That's a confinement if it's that long. And it's kind of an interesting definition, because we, by nature, in the wintertime, have 45 days with no growth in a lot of our winter fields. But in general, what we're really talking about with a dry lot is intentionally confining animals in a smaller space to be as efficient as possible with feeding. And people confine seasonally and year-round, and they make different decisions. What's really interesting is here, when we talk about seasonal barn use, we use it in the wintertime. When we talk about the upper Midwest doing seasonal barn use, they're more likely to actually use the barn in the summer months and then let their animals graze their corn stubble out on fields in the wintertime, because they have frozen ground and the ability to do it. So they make different spacing decisions in their barns for a seasonal use, whereas we have to sort of assign the worst condition, the most moisture, when we go to a seasonal, and we can't actually overstock our barns. We don't have that ability in the same way that they do. When we talk about dry lots, all of the numbers that are out there are for the upper Midwest. It's remarkable. I keep repeating it. I feel like a broken record sometimes doing this, but they're looking at 250, 300, 500 square foot, 800 square foot for cows with calves. We're looking at numbers well over 1,000, sometimes over 2,000 square foot to maintain soil structure underfoot. And it's still not being maintained particularly well, because our soils just do not hold up to the foot traffic. It is just the nature of the types of soils we have in this state. It's the reason that people don't use dry lots in the state, because they get in lots of trouble, and then they have to call NRCS to help them figure out ways to address issues because someone else has a problem with what they're doing. So dry lots are really difficult to manage here. And what we end up with then is a barn, if we need some way to confine animals in a fairly tight amount of space. When we define animals in a barn, it is really important to identify what type of animal they are, because the space that they need and the way we lay out the barn should look a little bit different for all of these groups. When we lay out a barn for feeders, they're only going to be so long if we're feeding animals to 800 pounds. We don't need to assume that we've got these Cadillac cows in there that are 8 feet long, and we need to have alley widths on the drover's alleys that are 14 feet or more so that cows can pass behind other cows that are eating. We can get away with a 12-foot alley very comfortably on a feeder barn. But if I design a 12-foot drover alley on a feeder barn, and then I want to move my big cows in there that are 1,500 pounds, I'm going to be very challenged to make that barn work for those cows. So it's really helpful to know ahead of time what type of animals are going to be in there so the barn can match the animals. On bedded barns, there are numbers out there for spacing. 80 to 120 is sort of the standard that is out there in most publications. We fall on the very top of this number. I would say at a minimum we need 125 square foot per head on a bedded pack barn, and realistically we need about 100 square feet of bedded pack area itself, plus area in the drover's alley for them to eat. That usually sets me at 135-ish square feet when I do a design, sometimes pushing up closer to 140. It's one of those reasons that I said when we get sold a package from the upper Midwest, sometimes the numbers don't quite play out because we actually have to build a little more space per cow. Dry cows, they have 25 to 30, 40 to 50. You know, I would still keep my cows well above 60. I'd be keeping them up closer to 80. And that's assuming that I have them on a high forage diet. If I start feeding them a hot feed, I'm basically feeding a heavy feeder, and I need to go back over to the drawing board again. And calves after weaning, those light calves, 20 to 25, 25 by NRCS, those numbers are not going to work here. Around here, when we feed, we're looking at 50, maybe 60 square foot, including the drover's alley. You guys can write all that down because I'm not going to publish it in any way because that number keeps changing. We had a number of years right when I got here, I was convinced I still didn't have enough square footage because it rained like 70 inches twice right after I moved here. But we've had a couple drier years now, and I'm starting to feel a little bit more comfortable with the numbers I'm telling you right now because it seems like year over year these numbers make sense. But it's a challenge to figure out because we have such large rainfall events and such a high precipitation total that we need enough square footage in these barns that our bedding costs don't outrun the ability to run a barn. If we start to narrow down our square footage for those head, we have to pay for it in bedding or fans. But fans in and of itself are not going to do enough. We need bedding in addition to it. And so we're finding that balance point between adding bedding and that operating cost versus having less head on in that barn to pay for the barn. So we're constantly struggling between that balance act to make these barns work. And so people will err different ways depending on their preference and their needs and how much they have to pay on their note this year. So good luck if that is you working on your barn right now. I know it is a challenge. With slatted floors, we can get away with a lot less square footage, 12 to 15 for those lighter feeders. But it is a challenge to bring lighter feeders onto a slatted floor barn too. There are some leg issues that occur with it. And certainly you can move dry cows onto slats, that's an option. Feed bunk space. Katie mentioned a bunch of this information. I just want to touch a little bit on the cow-calf side. This 24 to 36 inches of bunk space is really important. And I personally say I want 36 inches. I never want less than 36 inches of bunk space for a cow-calf pair in a barn. And the reason for that is because by 90 days of age, calves are eating 1% of their body weight in forage. If we're being really effective using our barns, we must be able to get the calves the ability to reach a bunk and figure out how to eat out of it. That is one of the major benefits of bringing them into a barn is being able to get them onto feed good, to wean them easier, to turn them into an animal that we can then turn around and feed effectively. But in order for that to happen, they have to know where the bunk is and how to get there. And if they're too narrow, we injure them getting to that bunk. And that is the last thing we want to do is injure a calf in a barn. So 36 inches is my number. For feeders, it says 9 to 18 linear inches. I know a lot of the work from the upper Midwest says those small calves can get away with some numbers, but it really has to be 18 for them to learn to eat out of a bunk. That seems to be the consensus. They don't all learn well unless they have at least 18 linear inches. Those heights, though, are really important. This is one of those things where that design looks different for different aged animals. So if I build a barn, the size bunk I choose, if I'm going to go get a J bunk, is going to look really different for a cow because I can choose a different lip height and a different volume that those J bunks can hold than if I have to get my calves in there that are going to need an 18-inch lip versus a cow that's going to be able to accept up to a 22 or 24-inch lip. So if I know I got lots of big cows with a high forage diet and a bulky feed, I want the biggest bunk I can get. But then I probably am not going to be able to turn around and retrofit that barn to work for 400-pound calves. So it's really important to consider that early in that planning process to get those things right. One of the things about these bunks is that animals will eat out of them differently. And for cow-calf, we have traditionally fed out on pasture, and we have been given a lot of forgiveness for having varying sized animals in our herd. When we move them into a barn, having a 1,200-pound and a 1,500-pound cow in the same herd is no longer going to work well. The genetics being that variable, the feed needs being that variable, the ability to push smaller animals off of the bunks. We don't feed our 5 weights and our 8 weights in the same pen, and there's a reason we don't do that. We can't feed a 1,000-pound cow and a 1,500-pound cow next to each other and be really successful. So if we think we're going to use a barn, we need very similar sized animals so that they can all eat together, eat the same ration, with similar genetics. Hopefully they will get the same weight gain or loss, depending on what we're trying to do. And we need to make sure that those bunks are big enough for the roughage that they're going to get. This water topic for me is one of these big ones that I think gets neglected a lot. And even by me, it gets neglected a lot when I talk to people. There's a lot of water requirements for cattle. And when we move them into a barn, we say, you're going to have to feed those cows twice a day. It's going to be really important. Well, you're also going to have to water those cows twice a day. And if you want them to eat the feed, they better drink the water. And for these animals, that can be a pretty significant volume. But putting water tanks into a barn is a little bit of a pain in the butt because we have to figure out how to fit them in so we can still scrape our alleys. And people don't want to pay for extra water tanks and have extra areas that are like nooks cut out of their bedded pack. So people tend to limit the number of water tanks that they install in a barn. But the space at that water tank is really important. And let me go one more here. These water specifications, I think, are pretty interesting. These are 3 commercial water tanks that are out there that I just pulled randomly off of the internet. All 3 of these water tanks say their herd capacity is 200 head of beef cattle or 100 head of dairy. Some have a little variation, but that's essentially what they're all telling us, is that they're 200 head beef. If I was putting these in, I would not assume that I could feed 200 head of beef cows in a cow-calf confinement barn off of one of these water tanks. If I had them out on pasture, I probably still wouldn't do it, but at least out on pasture, they're eating grass, their water intake is partially being absorbed by the pasture itself, and that they're going to have a little bit more space around that water tank to try and get up and negotiate. We need to be really careful. These water tanks are not that big if you're looking at it dimensionally, and the capacity in that tank to hold water is 20 gallons, 60 gallons, and 28 gallons. So there's only enough volume for 1 cow's drink at a time, basically in the first one, maybe up to 3 cows worth of drinking capacity in the second one, and 1.5 in the second one, in the third one, in the summertime, if they all need to drink 20 gallons in the summertime, right? If I'm going to put in 1 or 2 water tanks like this for a 100-head barn, I better have really good water lines coming up to this to be able to refill this as fast as they drink. Because these cows really need to be able to drink this water in under 2 hours. All my cows need to get through these water tanks in under 2 hours, twice a day, for us to get every cow to drink the way it needs to. The data on pasture is very clear. The behavior is very clear. If you look in a dairy barn, they do not limit water tanks for dairy cows because they know that they limit water, they limit milk. And that's what we're doing if we limit water availability in a cow-calf barn. We don't see it in the same way because we don't measure milk, but we'll see it on that production on those calves if we limit water. So really take your time, think about how many water tanks you need, think about what kind of water pressure you have, and make sure that that is not where you limit production. I mean, it would be a terrible spot to limit production on your water. I put this slide in here, it's almost tongue-in-cheek here in Kentucky. Dry, dusty conditions in a barn equal respiratory issues. Wet, muddy conditions equal poor performance. I have yet to see very many barns in Kentucky that ever show dry, dusty conditions other than when they immediately put down new bedding. Because of our rainfall totals and our humidity levels here, we fight muddy conditions in this state. Completely the opposite of some other areas of the US that I've worked with these barns. The important thing to note here is that, when Katie mentioned that she thought the environmental stressors in the upper Midwest were the bigger challenge here, but the important thing to think about is that mud is a big stressor, right? We're talking 15 to 25% losses in productivity just by walking in mud that's just above their hocks. If I move them into a barn and I can't manage my bedding and they're walking through a mucky barn, is it very different than leaving them out on the mud? Nutrient-wise, we might be collecting some of those nutrients back out of there, but from an animal performance, we basically have created a mud lot inside a barn that they're still struggling in, and they're not performing the way they need to. So we have to get that bedding right to have structure underfoot so that those animals can perform the way they're supposed to in the barn. And those calves in particular desperately need that barn to be dry enough that we don't end up with disease breaks. And that means we need to have the bedding content moistures below 60%, at or below 60%. And that can be challenging to do here. Oh, and this is just Katie said this before too. The cow-calf feeders all have spacing on their slats that's 1.5 to 1.75 inches. That's a standard beef cow slat or any sort of cow slat. That calves, if you were ever to put them onto slats, go onto what's known as a swine slat. And it's a 1.25 inch slat. It's a much narrower slat. What ends up happening is, and we saw this in Illinois, is that if you put those nice little slats in there so the calves can stand on them, the manure doesn't go through for the cows. So you're still scraping all of that manure off of there, or you're trying to stomp it through yourself, and that's not really how you wanted to spend your labor requirements on the barn, was trying to push manure through slats. Ventilation rate-wise, I don't do this because you're going to do a calculation about ventilation. In fact, I tell people all the time that most engineers can't do this calculation on a naturally ventilated barn, but I put this slide up here for two reasons. One, when I look at cold weather on cows, it still tells me that I need 50 cubic feet of air per minute per cow. If you were to think about this in terms of a volume, if I bought a refrigerator, about 6 foot tall, 3 by 3, 54 cubic feet. That means I need essentially about that volume of air for every cow in that barn every minute moving through that barn in the wintertime. That is not an insignificant volume of air I need to move just to keep the air fresh, to get rid of ammonia, to get rid of the moisture from those animals. There is a very large volume of air I need in the wintertime. And then when I go to the summer, I'm multiplying it by a factor of 10. It's essential on the ventilation to make these barns work the way they need to, that we get our sidewall heights right, that we get a nice roof elevation, and we get a ridge vent opening so natural ventilation can work. Two styles of ventilation: buoyancy, wind-driven. Buoyancy or chimney is the primary we use in the wintertime. We don't depend on wind in the wintertime. If we were in a more northerly climate, we might even put up curtains on the sidewalls, but because it is not that cold here, I'm going to take the wind anytime I can get it. Even in the wintertime, I'm not going to worry about it here. But if I don't have wind, I still need buoyancy to work to be able to get the stale air out. The way this works is these animals in the barn create heat. That heat mixes with the moisture coming out of their mouths, the moisture coming off of the manure on the floor, and all of that warm, moist air rises. In order for that to work, fresh air has to come in from the sides, and then that air has to go out of the very top of the barn. It is exactly like a chimney. The taller the chimney, the better the draw. The higher the roof line, the better the draw. Even these hoop barns, I know people sometimes don't think that they have this. They have a perfect example of buoyancy. They have a very tall middle considering how high their sidewall is. A lot of these are a 12 or sometimes a 14-foot sidewall. Most of them are 12s, at least in the original designs. But this opening up at the top is 30-ish feet on some of these barns, on the wider ones. That is a really nice steep roof on a hoop barn, right? That is the reason that they ventilate so efficiently. It is the reason if I had a gabled barn, I would want a 412 pitch. Never a 312. 312 will work. 412 will work significantly better. The wider your barn is, the better it's going to work, right? So it's going to give you that height to really draw that air out. From a wind-driven perspective, this is also really important. This means that we want to orient our barn correctly. We want our wind to go across our barn. And wind naturally does not like contact with lots of rough surfaces, and there are lots of rough surfaces inside a barn. So we want wind to go the shortest direction possible through the barn. I said before, here in Kentucky, we are very unlucky in that we can't predict that ventilation rate and the direction quite as well. But we want to set up that barn so that that wind has the shortest potential path. For most of this state, that means that that barn long axis is going to be perpendicular to the southwest. That southwest is usually our predominant wind direction, and if you need to, there is extension pubs on how to find a local windrows for you. Across a lot of the upper Midwest, a lot of the regions that are originally designed with these barns, we have winds in January in the wintertime that come from the north. Here in Kentucky, we don't have that. We have them going every direction there on the map. It's exactly what you would expect. A lot of influence by the Ohio River, a lot of influence by bodies of water. But generally, if we don't have any of those influences, it is a southwest wind. And in July, this whole upper Midwest shifts. All of their winds come from the south. And our wind still comes from the southwest. It's a very interesting dynamic. So for us, if we're orienting year-round, we're going to get the best wind from that southwest. But for the upper Midwest, they have this beautiful design that is perfect for a monoslope. In the summertime, they get those winds from the south. They receive them through this big, tall opening. That opening gets narrower. The wind goes faster. It actually accelerates through the barn. That's pretty cool. And then what happens in the wintertime is this smaller end of the barn receives the winds. The wind hits the barn opens up, the wind actually slows down. They basically essentially stop drafts by the design of their barn on their calves if they have them in a barn. It's a beautiful concept, plus they have a nice knee wall there. So it works perfectly if you are in a region where you get winds that alternate direction by season. We are not lucky enough to have that, but fortunately we don't have the cold weather where we really have that demand to slow those winds in the wintertime. We can take that wind all winter to dry out our bedding. So if you are setting it up like this, I mean, don't be upset that you're not getting that draft protection. You're actually getting enough wind that might actually help you dry out your bedding. So that's the only consolation, I guess. It's not the way they sold it to you, but it's still helping you out. And I just want to touch on last on this ventilation concept. One of the keys with all of these barns is what else is around your barn, because your barn is not going to ventilate if you are surrounded by like 3 silos and then 2 other barns. So be really aware of what other things are there. The last thing you want is to put a big machine shop right in front of your barn to receive the wind, because it's like a big giant sail in front of it that doesn't have any capacity for wind to go through it. So really be careful and set these barns where they need to be for air to flow the way it needs to. Couple final considerations here with calves and confinement. Calving season management is really going to be a challenge with a barn. Calving in a barn is a more challenging dynamic. Dystocia, disease, and specific diseases like scours, naval infections, cocci all show up at much higher prevalence rates than they do out on pasture. This is not a surprise. Katie mentioned exactly what was happening here. We have a population density here. We have to think about these young calves. We have to have a plan for how we're going to manage this calving to try and reduce. And it could be anything from tightening our calving windows to the sandhill systems to any number of other things. But all of that also plays into how we design the facilities. Things to be aware of is that there are more aggressive cows that are not necessarily meant to be in a barn. We have not chosen beef cattle for confinement. So they don't necessarily have the temperament for it. There are cows that will push small calves to get to feed. And not like gently push, but like trample. So we need to be aware if we're moving them into a barn that we're watching temperament. We need to be aware that those calves have access to feed and water, because if they don't have access to feed and water, what kind of growth are we going to get on them, and what kind of productivity are we going to get out of them? And make sure that they do have some protection from weather. I said before that this is a pretty mild climate, but that doesn't mean 35 degrees and raining isn't tough on a young calf. So one of the benefits here is I can calve in January and not have a mud issue, or February and not have a mud issue, but I do still have a weather concern that I have to manage. When we look at these are all different designs of calving pens, creep areas, and even this one, this is a really interesting design. These are essentially calving pens that are also set up to be part of a working facility in there. It's a pretty efficient use of space, and one that could be reworked when you're not in calving season to utilize some of that area as creep area. Similarly, this area back here on this barn is a concrete back wall. It's generally a creep area, but during calving season, this allows for a couple of small pens, so that first 24 hours, that cow-calf pair can be pulled out from the group to establish that maternal bond. For some people, that seems to be really necessary in their herds, depending on how those cows behave and how good they are as mamas. Some people actually don't care that they steal milk from everywhere, and that happens too in some people's barns. And so there's a little bit of a personal preference, but understanding that when we move them into a barn, we do have to somehow establish that bond if we really want to make sure we get the colostrum in to the calf from the cow, to make sure that the right animal gets what it needs. Creep areas need additional bedding. Creep areas are also very hard to clean out because we have essentially built them in such a way. So we want to be pretty aware if we're building creep areas that we also give ourselves a way to scrape and clean them when it comes to that time for clean out. We don't want to build them in such a permanent manner that we can't get our equipment in there, or that it's too narrow for our equipment. It's ideal for giving some supplemental feed, some protection from the wind, a good hot, solid knee wall on the side of it to keep wind out, and also protection from those bully cows. This is a really nice area for those calves to be calm and relaxed in. A lot of people will say that they'll go bring their cows up, feed them, and work them, and those cows will all happily lay in that creep area. They know how to get out of the way, and they will use it. And last but not least, this is my last topic. Don't worry, Jeff, I'm done. Don't jinx me. I haven't gotten to questions yet on retrofits. Retrofits, to me, are probably the biggest question that I can't answer. It's the it depends answer. Always it depends on whether or not a retrofit is the right decision. What was the barn used for previously is usually one of my first questions. If they say it was like a storage barn and it never had animals in it at all, I'm like, that's going to be a hard exchange to move that over to a cattle barn, because all of that ventilation I talked about needs to be managed. I need to have concrete in the right areas. I need to have water. And not necessarily was all of that accounted for when that barn was initially put in. So it can be a pretty challenging retrofit. Tobacco barns, I like using tobacco barns for working facilities. I like using tobacco barns for other things. This is a challenging use for a tobacco barn as a confinement operation. There are a lot of posts. A lot of them are on stobs. They are not actually attached. It is a beautiful design. It has lots of weight to it, but it does not have enough weight that if those cows run at it, they're not going to push that post off the stob. Those cows are very capable of doing that. The manure buildup is very significant in these barns, and the bottom of those posts will deteriorate with the manure. So if you're interested in retrofitting a tobacco barn, there is a significant investment that has to be made to protect the structure. And it is not an easy transition. Although ventilation-wise, it's one of the better designs out there, it's still actually not designed for the ventilation we need for cows. It's designed for the ventilation we need to cure tobacco. which is good, but not great. Dairy barns are one that I think a lot of times is very promising. In most cases, a dairy structure does have good concrete that's been scored correctly to structurally be sound for cattle. It usually has enough water tanks associated with it. Sometimes the free stalls can be a little challenging to retrofit into a laying area because we don't need stalls, we need larger pack areas, but this is one of those options that I think has a lot of potential as people are transitioning away from dairy in the state. I'm sorry if you're one of them. And poultry barns are the other one I get a lot of questions about out of Western Kentucky as people move out of contracts. This is one that I get a lot of consideration. This is an interesting one in the sense that there are a lot of cheap structures out there, structures that are already paid off, which is enticing. But it's not really designed for cattle, it's designed for poultry. The benefit is that they do have plenty of ventilation because I would just stock them at a much lower rate because I wouldn't want to clean them out at the rate I would need to if I stocked cattle in here at the rate I would stock poultry in a barn, if that makes sense. But there's certainly opportunities to utilize these structures if they exist on a farm. It just takes a little bit more planning because it is not the conventional design that we've typically seen. Other things to think about is, are the barns actually structurally sound? So if I've had a poultry barn that's 25 years old and I've had a lot of moisture in that barn, I better take a really good look at my trusses and decide if they are actually structurally sound. Are my nail plates good? Do I have a lot of rust on them? Have I had a lot of cracking in them? Have I had wind loads or snow loads that have challenged that barn? I need to know that because I have to be honest with myself whether or not that barn is structurally what I want to invest more money in to put cattle into. And then the other things you should ask yourself is, what do you hope to repurpose? Because sometimes it's not the whole barn. Sometimes you're like, I just want to repurpose my manure storage that was adjacent to this old barn, and that manure storage is really great and it works really good. I'm going to put a new barn for my cattle and I'm going to use the old manure storage, and that is sometimes a very enticing option. So take a good look at that, think about that, and then make sure you do have a budget for a retrofit. This is not a free option to bring cattle into a barn. Make sure that there is still money set aside for making the changes to make this work. And so my last couple thoughts from a facility perspective are not actually about the facility itself. These barns have a lot of labor associated with them. When we're doing this design work, we're trying to minimize that labor, trying to make that labor as easy to anticipate as possible, as regular as possible, so that people can plan and budget accordingly. But if we are not willing to do that labor, if we're not willing to do that management, it is a train wreck. The people I've seen that weren't prepared for the management really, really struggle in these barns. And you know, the economics are tricky on barns. I mean, there's a lot of cost associated with the barn, and that's not to be dismissed. But certainly there are a lot of costs associated with land and other things as well, so that has to be a decision made individually. And last but not least, this is the most facility relevant sort of final thought I have up here. Cow, calf, and feeder barns don't look the same. They look similar, but they do not look the same. So do not think you're going to build a barn, run your cow, calf, then run some feeders that you bring from the stockyards, then bring your cows back in. That is not a good use of a barn. The barn is designed to run cows. So if you'd like to run 2 different groups of cows that calve in fall and spring, and they're all your own cows and they're closed herds, I think you have opportunities to do that. But do not think that this barn is going to really perform for you if you bring in different size and age groups continuously, because you will be constantly fighting getting that barn set up the way it needs to operate for those different size animals. Any questions?